Do you mind explaining what we mean by Section 28 or what Section 28 was?
Yes, absolutely. So, Section 28, or to give it its full title, Section 28 of the Local Government Act, was a law that was in place in the UK between 1988 and 2003 in England and Wales, but it was repealed in 2000 in Scotland. And it said that local authorities to whom all schools belonged at the time, we didn't have academy chains like we have now, so that schools must not promote homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. So the wording of it was very vague. Those of us that were teachers at the time didn't really know what it meant, but the effects of it were that between 1988 and 2003, people like me who were teachers in secondary schools or in any schools at the time believed that if we were to come out in our school workplace or we were to be outed in our school workplace as lesbian or gay, we would lose our jobs. We felt that, or our understanding of the law was that anybody that you couldn't talk about being gay to young people in schools.
And just for context, before that law, before Section 28, what was the rule, the policy, or was there nothing said about homosexuality?
Well, do you know what? I don't have any direct experience because I entered teaching and Section 28 entered teaching in exactly the same year. So as I started my first job, my first job was at a convent school in Liverpool, and I was a PE teacher. And I don't know what life was like before this law, because as soon as I started my teaching career, the law was in place. And being in a convent school, it was a very conservative kind of atmosphere anyway. My senior leadership team in my school were all nuns, and the Catholic faith and the teachings of the Catholic faith were very important. And so I almost felt as though there was a double reason to keep my head down and hide who I was.
And I'm just for context again for the date. So 1988, we're talking about under Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, and I believe it was Baroness Knight who introduced the policy. Is that right?
Yes. Well, it was Lord Halsbury that brought the bill through the House of Lords, and as the bill was being debated, it was called Clause 28, and once the law was passed, it became Section 28. And actually, the parliamentary transcripts of the day of that debate in the House of Lords about whether to introduce this new law really does give you some insight into the kind of the climate of the time and how people viewed people in same-sex relationships. I've got a little bit of it here. So Lord Halsbury, when he was debating section or clause 28 as it was, he said in the House of Lords, homosexuals suffer from a psychological syndrome whose symptoms are as follows. First of all, exhibitionism. They want the whole world to know about them. Second, promiscuity. Thirdly, proselytizing. They want to persuade other people that their way of life is a good one. Fourthly, boasting of homosexual achievements. Lastly, they act as reservoirs of diseases of all kinds. So that tells something of the political climate of the time.
Wow.
that it was okay to say that. And, Lord Longford, then, he's a bit more sympathetic. He chips in and he says, homosexuals, in my submission, are handicapped people. The tragedy of such people is they cannot enjoy family life and they cannot have children. So, a very, very different kind of climate as regards to sexual identity.
I thought I'd try and I'm so baffled by that. I was going to try and experiment with some of my groups. Actually, I'm going to read that out to them and get them to estimate what year they think that was written. I don't think they would come up with 80s. I think they thought that's Middle Ages or something, but that's
absolutely.
yeah, it's crazy that was
Yes.
written from there.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's taken me back a little bit. I did
Sorry.
wonder. No, I did wonder as well. Was there a significant event or something which kicked the Section 28 into action? Was there something significant that happened in the media or in the mainstream world which caused that to come into effect?
I mean, I see that there was a children's book which is a little yellow book that has a yellow cover with photographs on the front, and it was called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and it was a book that had been initially published in Denmark. The author was Suzanne Bosch. And she was aware that in Denmark, there were a number of young people growing up with two mums or two dads, but there were no children's books at the time that showed different sorts of families. So she wrote this book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. And in the mid-80s, it was translated into English and it was brought over to the UK. And some of the left-wing Labour-controlled local authorities in London, including Ken Livingstone's Greater London Council, bought some copies of this book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, for libraries. And Mrs. Thatcher's government wanted to sort of position the Labour Party as this sort of radical, loony, and I mean they were called the loony left. Thatcher's government called them the loony left, and this little yellow book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, became almost a symbol of the left wing of the Labour Party as far as the Conservatives were concerned, using taxpayers' money to corrupt innocent young minds with books such as Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and then the tabloid press, particularly the sort of Tory tabloid press at the time, really jumped on board with this and started to create this moral panic around schools and anybody, local authorities that were Labour run being very, very irresponsible and somehow having an agenda to corrupt the innocent minds of young people. So that's where it came from. I mean, looking back, I think that really this wasn't a genuine concern about whether teachers were responsible or not. I think it was just a vicious fight for votes between a very right-wing Conservative Party and the left of the Labour Party, and those of us that were lesbian and gay teachers or young people struggling with our sexual identity during that era became collateral, really, in this kind of political fight.
Yeah, and for those people in that scenario, I kind of had two questions. The first question was, if a student did broach the subject, they asked in a lesson something about homosexuality or disclosed their sexuality to a teacher, what did the law actually say? Was it that you just couldn't discuss it? You had to say this is not up for discussion.
I mean, the law was as I told you, the wording was as I sort of recited it at the start of our session. The truth of the matter is, we didn't know what it meant. The wording was so vague that, and it really did add to the confusion because we didn't know what we were allowed to say and what we were not allowed to say. So there was this complete culture of silence around it. I mean, my book about Section 28, I've called that book Pretended, because it says that my relationship was a pretended family relationship. The law said that, but actually it led me to pretend as a teacher in lots of ways. And one of the things I pretended to do was to be far too busy if I thought that a young person was about to come out to me and tell me that they were worried about, or concerned or wanted some support around their own sexual identity, because I felt that to enter into any form of conversation with a young person would be to put me at risk of being sacked.
And talking about that, did you feel your own sexuality put you at risk of being sacked anyway? So if you were seen out in a lesbian bar, for example, or someone found out who your partner was that a genuine threat that you could be sacked from your job?
yes, that was absolutely my
What grounds
fear.
would they what grounds would they sack you on? I'm just trying to get my head around it.
Well, of breaking I would be breaking the law.
Mm.
The law said that we must not promote it as a pretended family relationship. So we believed that if that once our sexuality was known, that our position would be untenable in the workplace, and so we we went to great lengths to separate out our professional and personal identities, and that involved living miles and miles out away from the school catchment area, making sure that if we did go to gay bars, that we weren't seen leaving or entering the building, or we would go to the next city or something like that. So yeah, we went to lengths, and because the wording of Section 28 was so vague, we were waiting all the time for somebody to be prosecuted, and actually, looking back, not one teacher was ever prosecuted. And now I look back at the wording of Section 28, I think it was pretty unenforceable. I don't know that they could have prosecuted anybody, but we didn't know that at the time. I don't know. I'm sort of, nothing happened to me as far as I was never disciplined or anything as a member of staff under Section 28. I am aware of people that I know now who were teachers in London who, when they did try to come out, their school would move them on to another school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they never lost their job, but they just got sent to another school, and sort of the problem was moved on for a little bit if they were too obviously gay.
Yes, I see. And just from your point, anecdotally, kids are curious, right? They ask all the time, like, are you married, sir? Do you have children? Those sort of things. So out of interest, what did you do when kids asked, have you got a husband, miss?
Yeah, I did. I had a whole host of strategies that was sort of down to lying, making up boyfriends, forgetting often who I'd said to, what I'd said to which class. But I was also continuing this charade in the staff room as well. People who knew me then have said to me since, you were always a very, very private person. You never talked about your private life, and so we thought that we should just leave you alone. You always closed down the conversation. That's what staff have said to me. And that's how I did it, really. And I was always kind of 2 sentences ahead of myself in any situation, trying to anticipate what somebody might ask and deflect the conversation in a different direction. So, that took so much energy to be completely on guard and completely hyper alert all the time, and try and literally steer away from conversations if I thought those questions were going to be asked. And of course, if I was spotted by a student when, I don't know, I was in the supermarket with my partner doing the shopping, my partner and I would just walk off in separate directions until the student and their family had gone.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
You've mentioned it already, your book. I'll give the full title: Pretended Schools and Section 28, Historical, Cultural and Personal Perspectives. So we've kind of covered what Section 28 is. Do you want to say a little bit more about what's in the book?
Yeah, sure. So the book is in three distinct parts. The first part is it looks at the history of sexual identity and schools, and it starts with the earliest laws around homosexuality in this country, and almost the challenges that both male and female teachers had in history, because originally teaching was a career for men and for men only, which sort of was on a par with something like law or medicine. And then when sort of the male population went off to fight in the world wars, women started to take those teaching positions, and then teaching became synonymous with caring and sort of childcare. And so when men returned to teaching, they were deemed to be effeminate and not masculine enough to do this, what would now turned into women's work. So anybody that returned to teaching after the wars was seen, the men were seen as effeminate. But the women, I mean, back in the day, you couldn't be as soon as you got married as a woman, you had to leave your career and be a housewife and a mother. So actually, because teaching often came with accommodation, you were able, as a female teacher, to live in the schoolhouse. Then those women found a way of having a career, being financially independent without the need of a man, and it was a way to live with other women. And they equally, whether they were gay or not, were often described as too forceful and too dominant and too independent and masculine. And so for teaching, it was this really problematic kind of occupation where it was too effeminate a career for men and too masculine a career for women. So that's the sort of starting point, and it takes it looks historically and politically right up to Section 28 and the repeal of Section 28 and various prime ministers apologising for voting for it. And then the middle part, the biggest part actually of Pretended, are my diary entries. So I kept a diary when I was a PE teacher, and I talked about my experiences, wrote about my experiences, whether that was bumping into one of my sixth form netballers in a nightclub under Section 28 and being absolutely terrified that on Monday morning I would lose my job, down to sort of assumptions made about me by other members of staff. So those diaries are part two. And then the final part of the book looks at the progress that we've made and how much more inclusive schools are now, and pieces of legislation like the Equality Act, like the Marriage Same-Sex Act of 2013, those key pieces of legislation that have helped schools directly or indirectly to be more inclusive.
Thank you. And you've just sparked my mind into something else, because you mentioned bumping into your student netball player, and that's a scene from the film Blue Jean, which I thought we'd mention as well. So I saw it a couple of weeks ago, really enjoyed it, thought it was absolutely fantastic. I didn't realise your involvement in it until I did a little bit more research. I believe you make a cameo in the film as well.
I do. I play a netball teacher opposite Rosie McEwen, who plays the lead teacher, Jean. I'm in it for about 3 seconds. I don't think Olivia Colman need worry anytime soon that I'm going to be challenging her for an Oscar. But it was great fun. It really was. But my main role was as an advisor on the film. So the diary entries that I've published in my book Pretended, I shared with the writer and director of Blue Jean, Georgia Oakley, and she drew on some of them to create the screenplay for Blue Jean. And one of those examples was when I went down to my local gay bar with my girlfriend and two other friends, and one of my sixth formers was in the bar. And that was the Saturday night, and on Monday morning, I fully expected that she would go into school and tell the head teacher, a nun, that she'd seen me in a gay bar, and then under Section 28, that would be the end of my career. Actually, what happened was not that at all. This student came to see me on the Monday morning and said, I think I'm gay. Please don't tell anybody in the sixth form where I was. I'm really worried. I've got nobody to talk to about my sexual identity, and I was very mean to her. I sent her back to the sixth form common room and said I was too busy to talk to her, and didn't give her any support, and put my own career before any genuine concern for this young person. And, you know, had she told me that she was pregnant or there was some difficulty in other areas of her life, I'd have moved heaven and earth to support her. But this was something I didn't feel that that it was too risky for me to help her.
Yeah, and that part's sort of depicted in the film, isn't it? Was there anything else from your own experience that is in the film Blue Jean? If people, maybe they've already seen it or they're thinking about going to see it.
I mean, just the day to day, really. You know, the nosy neighbour next door who disapproves of of Jean's lifestyle, the way in which Jean is expected to sort of drop Viv, and you know, that her relationship's not acknowledged with her family, and that she's sort of the babysitter. And Viv has to go home. So there's that lack of acceptance from the family. And I guess what was really great was the way in which the bar scenes in Blue Jean were depicted, and that sense of when you went down to those bars, that was the place where you could really be yourself, and perhaps the only place that you could be yourself. And I know in the film, Jean's described as a deer in the headlights. And I spent a lot of time with Rosie McEwen before filming started, talking about my own experiences, and that sense of always needing to be two sentences ahead and being terrified that somebody was going to ask you a personal question. I think, you know, when I've seen the film and when I was on set watching the scenes being filmed, I thought that Rosie as Jean captured that absolutely fantastically well.
Yeah,
that real terror and anxiety, and you know, that for day in, day out for 15 years.
I totally agree. I think it was perfectly captured. I think as well, the depictions of the 80s, like you said, in the clubs, normally around a pool table, wasn't it, with alcohol and plumes of smoke, as everyone was smoking their cigarettes as well. And the background music, I thought it caught the 80s absolutely perfectly there.
Yeah, it certainly did, and the school scenes as well. You know, the school had not been used since the 1980s, and so much of it was familiar, and all the fantastic young actors that played the netballers. You know, and I literally was transported back to the 1980s when I walked into that gym, and you know, everything everybody was wearing was the same. I was walking around set going, I had those trainers, I had that shirt. It really was so evocative. It was, and of course, I'd sent all my photographs to the costume team of what I was wearing, you know, out on the scene, and obviously in school as a PE teacher. So yeah, it brought a lot of memories back.
Yeah. Fantastic film. So if you haven't seen it, please do go and see that. It's called Blue Jean. Just thinking about Section 28, you said it came to an end in 2003. So we're talking under Tony Blair's new Labour government. Yes. So do you want to say a little bit about how it kind of came to an end in 2003?
Yes. It to say that it sort of fizzled out like a soggy log is probably the best way to describe it. I think people expect that Section 28 was repealed and that schools all turned into this inclusive, fantastic gay spaces where everybody could suddenly be themselves, and it was about as far from that as possible. Because it was a local authority act and not a school act, there was no circular that came from the government to head teachers to say, Section 28 is over, continue, you're all free to be whoever you want to be. And so, the school leaders were largely under the impression that it was still continuing and nothing changed at all. All the national press that had enjoyed these real salacious headlines during Section 28, because if a teacher was outed as gay, it was often national news. It was often on the front of some terrible tabloid, and those same newspapers did not report the repeal of Section 28 at all. The only paper actually that did report it was The Guardian, and they buried something on about page 6, a tiny little article on page 6. So schools largely carried on in exactly the same way. And I look back, I stayed in teaching actually until 2010. So I had another 7 years after Section 28. And I call those 7 years the don't ask, don't tell years, because, attitudes were starting to change in society. We were starting to see storylines of same-sex couples on soaps, for example, and some and things like I don't know, gay people being on Big Brother. I remember that being a massive big deal, and we started to realize that gay people weren't necessarily people with 5 heads and these monsters. But what happened was there was this kind of unwritten rule that like don't ask, don't tell, which said if you're discreet and you don't mention it, we won't give you a hard time about it. Don't ask, don't tell, as you're probably aware, originated with Bill Clinton's move to allow lesbian, gay, bisexual people to serve in the military. And in the military, what happened was, rather than there being members of the service personnel who would actively ransack the bedside tables of serving officers to see whether they'd had a love letter from a same-sex partner, they stopped doing that and said, if you're very discreet about it and don't parade your identity in our faces, then we will turn a blind eye. And that's what school was like. It was like, you be discreet and we won't ask you, and we'll just ignore the fact. When I look back on that now, what I thought was an act of tolerance at the time, and felt that I was in quite a liberal school, and that was the arrangement, or the implicit arrangement, was that actually meant that I was never given the time or the space to speak my authentic identity into existence in my workplace. There's nothing very, very inclusive about that at all.
No, you've just made me think, actually, because I was teaching at the time, very early in my teaching career, and I have no recollection of the law changing. So that's really interesting that you said that. That kind of answers my own question, actually.
Yeah.
And having said that as well, that was 2003. So you had civil partnerships, but we're talking another decade before gay marriage in the UK.
Yes. So I think we had civil partnerships in 2006. I was still teaching then, but I didn't tell anybody. And my parents didn't come to my civil partnership. My partner and I just went with our 2 best friends to the local registry office and had our civil partnership. And then, of course, by 2013, when the Marriage Act came in, those of us that were in civil partnerships, all we were invited to do was to go back to the local registry office and fill in an upgrade form. So my marriage was one that was just my civil partnership was very low key. My marriage was even more low key because we simply went and filled in the upgrade. So not very romantic at all.
No, it's always interesting, isn't it? I mentioned this earlier in the show, but when I talk to A-level students who are 16, 17, 18, I always get them to guess, when do you think gay marriage was first allowed in the UK, for example? And they normally guess in the late 70s or something like that. So I think for them to learn that, we're not talking that long ago, we're only talking sort of 10 years ago, and that Section 28, this was around not that long ago, actually. I think they're often quite surprised by that. It sounds like a completely different era, doesn't it? Completely different world.
Yeah, it does. It does. And in some ways it was. But then I can see one of the things about being old and being around a long time is you start to see things happen in cycles. And I am very concerned when I see the same sort of irresponsible tabloid headlines and political point scoring around trans and non-binary identities. Now it feels very much like Section 28 felt during the time, and it's a matter of huge regret to me that that our personal identities become collateral, become caught in the crossfire of political point scoring. I do hope that we don't look back on this era right now and see it as almost Section 28 2.0 for our trans and non-binary members of our community.
Yeah, there seems, you mentioned the idea that the left got called the loony left. We're now hearing, the ultra woke. They almost seem like a parallel, don't they?
Absolutely right. And we've got a similarly right-wing government at the moment that reminds me very much of Thatcher's government. And, when we see attempts in Scotland to make amendments to the Gender Reform Act, and then those amendments being vetoed by Westminster, they're real people's lives. And just as every single day of my teaching career was affected, or the 15 years of my teaching career was affected by this law. And, it was just casual point scoring between the left and right. And we see that now. Real lives are being deeply affected by point scoring between Scotland and Westminster in this case. It's so similar. It's frightening.
Yes, agreed. Catherine, thank you so much for your time today. I always ask people if they want to give out any details at the end, if people want to add you on Twitter or find out more about the book, or if they want to go and watch the film Blue Jean. Do you want to give out any details at all?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'm really happy to. I am on Twitter. I'm Dr. Catherine Lee. I'm also on Instagram, like a young person. I'm Dr. Catherine Lee 1. As you've said, my book is out now. It's available in Waterstones and Amazon and anywhere else. It's called Pretended Schools and Section 28. And the film Blue Jean is still on at cinemas. If you Google it, you should be able to see where near you can go and see it. And I noticed the other day it's available to pre-order on Sky Store, so you'll soon be able to watch it at home. I guess the other thing that I did just want to say, if that's okay, was that I'm always conscious when I talk about Section 28 that I talk about lesbian and gay identities, and I don't use the more inclusive acronym of LGBTQ as we tend to today. That's not because I'm excluding gender identities. It's that Section 28 related only to sexual identity, to homosexuality. Now, that's not to say that trans and non-binary people were having a fantastic time and were able to be themselves in school. It was, their identities were almost, not acknowledged at all. But I do just want to stress that I'm not sort of excluding trans and non-binary people when I talk about Section 28. It's just that it was sexuality only during that time.
No, I think that's a really important point to make. Catherine, thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with the book. And thank you very much for chatting to me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.